Okay, welcome back, everybody. Of course, it would be nice to open up this bond and to start with this celebration. Being together again is a celebration, but what will become a theme over the next few weeks is that we know that like we just said, that in our history, our legacy, and in our destinies, part of the way that Kadosh Baruch Hu ordained the world is that there's Choshech and Or, there are dark times and light times. We're promised that the Or will always follow the Choshech, but sometimes, as we know, our day starts with Choshech and then ends in Or. So tonight we are here post Mariv to commemorate the most devastating tragedy that has hit our people since the Churban for sure, including the Churban. It was a tremendous Churban in and of itself. So such an important time in our history that those who started the country, the founders of our land, decided that there has to be a day that commemorates what happened during the Holocaust. The choice of that day, as many of us know, is very controversial. In religious life, we already have days that mark tragedy. Tisha B'Av is the day of greatest tragedy. Anybody know what the other day of national mourning is for us on the Jewish calendar? So that's definitely a bad day, but that's not the official one. So that's also a sad day, but that's for the more recent tragedies of Israel. Excellent. Boss. Sarah B'Teves was the other day of national tragedy. So until 1951-ish, so that was the day that was actually celebrated and marked to commemorate the Holocaust Memorial. And those who had lost relatives that didn't know what day they were killed on. Many of them, it's not like today when we have phones and we have communication. Many of them were murdered. Were exterminated on unknown dates. You didn't know when somebody was transported from the ghetto to Treblinko or Sobibor or Belzec. You didn't know when your family was escorted out to the forest and gunned down. So they said those people were assigned Asar B'Teves as the official day of mourning. So how did we come to today? Chav Zayin Nisan. Where did this come from? So in 1959, I believe the Knesset decided that it's too humiliating to only celebrate or only to commemorate the suffering of the Jews. There were many moments of heroism and acts of strength and bravery that took place during the war. And the most popular one, of course, is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, where the Jews of Warsaw held out for a month. It was longer than the Polish and the French armies held out against the Nazis. Unbelievable Mesiras Nefesh. And in order to give a sense of strength, and they called the day Yom HaShoah is the official name of the day. So that's why they wanted to choose something around this area. This is not the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising did happen also on Chav Zayin. Really, we know it was the 14th or the 15th of Nisan. That was when when we were saying the Seder and declaring our Theros. So that's when the Jews rose up, revolted, and rebelled. But Chav Zayin is 7 days after Pesach and 8 days before Yom HaAtzmaut. So since it's right in between, so they chose this was the day they were going to mark Yom HaShoah. When I was your age, and before I turn the floor over to your friends, we're going to take over for the rest of the program. When I was your age, I did not have an appreciation for the Holocaust. To be honest, I don't think that I had appreciation until I started doing the guiding on the trip. And if that's true, I probably still don't have an appreciation because every year that goes by, every day that goes by, that I read something else or I send something else, I find something else, I discover a new story. So the body of work of the Holocaust becomes a totally different experience for me. The first time that this was brought to my attention, as many of you know, was from Dudy's father, who recently passed away. When he spoke right here at this bima on one Yom HaShoah, and he was talking about what happened in the cattle cars and the hardships. It's impossible to even imagine. When they were there for days, so standing, of course, is going to be rough, and the darkness is going to be rough, and the starvation is going to be rough. I don't know. I never really thought about what the facility availability, let's say, was, and what that meant when you're in a cattle car for 4 days, 5 days, 8 days, or like the Jews in Greece for 11 days. And as he was talking, I was trying to internalize what he was saying. So it really hit me that even though we could use terminologies like Auschwitz, and we could say Treblinko, and we could talk about gas chambers and extermination camps, but we can't really relate to, we can't really understand, and we can't really feel what our fathers and our grandfathers, what they suffered through in those years. What we'll try to do tonight is that for those who went on the trip to Poland, we had 6 volunteers. Obviously, 6 is a big number for the 6 million. So even though what each of them is going to speak about doesn't necessarily correspond to exactly 1 million, but we'll have six speakers to share of their experience on Poland and what spoke to them personally. So that hopefully it could spark some kind of feeling, and hopefully inspire us to spend the next 24 hours to do maybe a drop more research, read a little bit more. We're not going to get the whole picture, but even just to start walking down the path and going on a journey of appreciating what it meant, certainly for the martyrs who were killed in the Shoah, for those who rose up and revolted, and for those very few left that are survivors, to give us an appreciation and sensitivity to them. So we can't talk about destruction unless we speak about what Poland and Europe was like before. So we ask Eli Burstein to introduce us.
When Robin Tunnel texted on the Yeshiva group chat about if anyone wanted to volunteer to talk about the Poland trip, I was uncertain because this is my first time speaking in front of everyone in the base this year, but I felt like this was something important to talk about. So I asked Robin Tunnel and said, could I please talk about our time in Krakow over Shabbos? Because when we were going on the trip, there had been issues about COVID and testing and being safe, and because of that, we were in Shabbos, we were in Krakow for Shabbos. I think it was like the first time that it had been done on the trip. Not sure. One of the first times. And what struck me there was how empty it felt. We were in, I think, 3 or 4 different shows over that Shabbos, and it was basically just us on the trip, just our group. And even in different parts, even later on the trip and before on the trip, these were these beautiful, historic, hundreds of years old places where people gathered to pray, and it was empty. It was defaced. Some of it had been restored, but a lot of it was ruined in some ways. So I felt that since Ron Tunnel said that I'd be the first one to speak, I thought it'd be important to just kind of set the stage by thinking about just the mindset of how much had changed pre and post war, and even in the years following the war in Poland. Polish Jewry, there's a history of about 1,000 years of Jews living in Poland, and it actually was one of the largest Jewish communities within Eastern Europe on the eve of the war. About 10% of the Polish population was Jewish, which at the time the census estimates it was about 3.3 million Jews. Specifically in Krakow, the Jewish population was about 350,000 people, and that made up about 20% of the city's population. So one out of every 5 people you saw was likely a Jew. That statistic is very different following the war, and even nowadays it's even lower. Of 3.3 million people, a million Jews living in Poland pre-war, only 380,000 of them were documented to have survived. And out of the 350-ish thousand people, Jews in Krakow, that went down to about 30,000. It's like taking the population of the United States, which is about 329 million, and just removing the whole entire population of Texas, which is about 30 million. Or if you took out the population of New York once, and then half the population of New York again. That was how big of a removal that it was. The Jewish population, 90% was killed within Poland. On, I think it was Friday night, the chief rabbi of Krakow came to speak to us at the shul after we had finished Kala Shabbat. And he was speaking to us about what he does engaging in the Jewish community, and people who come to him saying that their grandparents on their deathbed said, "I'm Jewish." And he's trying to like get us to understand how large of a disconnect there was. And I looked into it more afterwards, and how in the Soviet Union, of those 30,000 that stayed, that survived, a small portion of them actually stayed post-war. And of those, after the 6-Day War, a lot of them were either expelled, and this was only in Poland, or they hid their Judaism. So, and it was interesting to me. And so I did more research. I looked into it more, and it was astounding to me, thinking back on it, that here is a person which is trying to raise awareness to the Jewish community, and he was talking to us about some festival that happens in Krakow as commemoration of the Jewish community that used to be there, which was great. But the total Jewish population of Poland now, after the war, after the people who fled or hid their Judaism, that's a documented Jew who will say they're a Jew, is only about 20,000 people at the maximum. And each statistic that I looked at, each drop, each change just hit me more and more about how large, how drastic a change has happened over the years. I think that, like, if there's one thing to just think about this year and every year as Yom HaShoah comes around, is how few Holocaust survivors there are left in the world today. I was reading an article this morning about how many Holocaust survivors there are documented in the state of Israel, and the number is currently at 161,400 people, with their average age being 85.5 years old, and less than around 20 of them have made it to over 100 years old. The average, on average, 40 of them pass away every day. And running the numbers, if they pass away at that rate, then at the maximum, there will be no more Holocaust survivors living in Israel in 11 years. But they're getting older, they're aging. So that is an optimistic number. So if there's anything that I want to take in as Yom HaShoah starts, as we are getting into the headspace for this year's and next year's, and every year's Yom HaShoah, is just how empty and how much has been lost, so that we can ourselves carry the torch and carry their memories for them.
commemorate the majesty of what Jewish life was in Poland before the war. So don't be tempted to it. But we get it this time.
5 attempts later.
Commemorate all the Jews that were murdered in forests, gunned down by bullets. Zach Goldberg.
While the Holocaust claimed in total around 6 million Jews, perpetrated mass shootings and massacres were responsible for roughly 2 million of those deaths. These 2 million murders were what was known as the Holocaust of bullets. The majority of mass shootings usually consisted of a 5-step process. Step 1, the German units and local townspeople would round up the Jewish residents of a town or village. Step 2, these Jewish residents were marched out in broad daylight to a predetermined location somewhere on the outskirts of the city. 3, like the city that they were taken from. 3, the Jewish people would either be forced to dig their own graves or they would be taken to graves already prepared in advance, usually through forced labor of the local peasants. 4, all the men, women, and children were then shot or thrown and then shot into these graves. The shootings usually took place in broad daylight, in full view, and in earshot of the local townspeople. And 5, the graves were then covered up with dirt as the Nazis attempted to cover up their tracks. While there have been many mass shootings throughout the Holocaust, one of the lesser known massacres is what transpired in the outskirts of the Buchina Forest, near the town, also known as the Children's Forest, near the town of Tarnow on June 11th, 1942. On that day, this place was anything but peaceful. It was a place of horrors, and the scene of one of the most brutal and barbaric murders in history. It was the place where over 800 Jewish babies and children from the Tarnow orphanage were pushed, bayoneted, prodded, and thrown into various ditches. Those who couldn't walk, particularly the babies, were put into a dumpster truck. This truck drove all the way up to one of the ditches and dumped the crying babies right into it. Once the children were in the ditches, the Nazis then shot the children into the ditches and blew them up with grenades. The screams of innocent, dying babies and children were drowned out as the shots and grenade explosions rang out. Eventually, the screaming subdued. As the screaming stopped, the Nazis had the peasants cover up the ditches with dirt to try to cover up their tracks. One can only imagine, in the silence of today's forest, the cries of abject terror that filled the air that day as the German soldiers opened fire, shooting and throwing hand grenades into the ditch until the children's screams were silenced. When I first see the small park in the bordering forest, it seems pleasant, quiet, and peaceful. During the summer months, one could mistake it for a small public park. What could have possibly happened here? I think to myself. It just didn't feel like anything bad could have ever happened in this place. Yet after hearing this story, the forest takes on an entirely new meaning. It's cold, dark, dreary, and dead. Everything about it is raw. You can tell something looks amiss here. It is as if the trees are ashamed of what has happened here. After hearing what transpired here some 80 years ago, we are given letters from our parents and grandparents for us to read, and we're allowed to walk around the forest and kind of just roam around. I look around the blue fenced off areas, the places where the pits were. How many of these kids were old enough to dream of what their lives could be, how they could change the world, how they can help others? How many were old enough to dream, but still young enough to believe that with all their heart, anything was possible? That they can be anything in the world that they wanted to be, that they can change the world. These children were just like me and you. They had aspirations. They thought they were invincible. They wanted to explore the world. They had their hobbies, favorite kinds of food, favorite toys, favorite subjects in school. These children, many of whom were still innocent enough to believe that there can be no such evil in this world and that everyone was their friend, were robbed of the opportunity to live out their dreams. And what about the babies who can neither speak nor walk, who were just torn away from their mothers and fathers and just needed attention, affection, care, and love? Who will remember these 800 should-haves, would-haves, and could-haves? They could have changed the world and made a difference in people's lives. Instead, these 800 were never given a shot. They were never able to see their potential be fulfilled. Their innocence shielded them from seeing what was happening to them. They didn't know what was going on around them. And when the shots rang out, and the oldest ones, around age 9, had some idea of what was going on, it was too late. They died with a sense of confusion. This is a place of broken and forgotten dreams, of shattered hopes, of pain and suffering. The 800 never had a chance to make a difference in this world, to live out their lives full of success, happiness, and joy. They never had the chance to get married and start families of their own and to watch their kids grow up and then eventually have their own kids also have kids of their own. So it's our job to never forget them and to tell their stories. These children, they had faces. They had parents. Some had siblings. They had memories, fears, ambitions. They were just like me and you. As a kid, I used to always dream. I felt invincible, that the world was at my fingertips, and that all I had to do was go out and chase my dream and see it come to fruition. My dream was to be a professional baseball player. And for a bit, I really thought I could do it. Then reality hit. But my innocence allowed me to see the good in everything and everyone. That's what innocence and naivety does to you. These 800 had it too. They were murdered in cold blood on June 11th, 1942. I was born 61 years later on June 12th. The closest in dates helps me put into perspective that these children were just like I also once was. I then opened the letters that were handed to me. I read one from my dad's parents and the other one from my mama's mother, who had passed away not even 3 weeks later. After reading the letters, with tears streaming down my face, I realized how proud my grandparents are of me, and of the importance of keeping the memories of those who perished alive, to keep the memories alive of those who perished, and to never forget our history and what had happened here 80 years ago. It is up to us to remember our brothers and sisters who suffered at the hands of the Nazi regime. Why was I allowed to grow up, to live up my dreams and chase my aspirations, but these 800 weren't? It's a question I've pondered a lot since visiting the Vicenza forest. Only Hashem knows the answer. It's our job not to question his ways, but rather to move forward, carrying their memories and stories with us wherever we go, ensuring that the world never forgets the atrocities of the Holocaust and what had taken place in a small peaceful park, or in a small once peaceful park, on the outskirts of a now decimated town and the desert and in a deserted forest.
in honor of those who were killed in mass graves and shot down by bullets, especially the 800 that were killed in the forest outside of Zabatovsky Gora. Travel light a candle in their memory. Invite up Kobe Cohen to share with us the terror of Majdanek.
Approximately 360,000 people were murdered in Majdanek. The Nazis used gas chambers to kill thousands of innocent souls and then burned them in the crematorium. It was an absolute horror, and we were able to see these horrors clearly when we went there back in December, as Majdanek is still basically fully intact and could be up and running in just a few days. Our first stop in the camp was the gas chamber. We first passed through the showers and then saw the actual gas chambers. So we took a very similar path to those back in the Holocaust. The only difference was that they were murdered there and we got to walk out alive. We saw the barracks of the Jews and the horrible living conditions that they had to go through. And we also saw a room filled with shoes of the victims, which really made it feel real. As before we were just hearing about all of these different murders and experiences, but now we were actually seeing something that belonged to them and was taken from them, just like many other things, including their freedom. The shoes came in all different sizes, as the Nazis murdered everyone, from children to adults. One very powerful moment for me, and personally, it was when we all went around in that room saying one word that we were feeling at that moment, as we were able to connect and see how each other were all feeling. Just walking around the camp and seeing the wooden buildings and the barbed wire fences made me feel sick inside. Just thinking about what could have gone on here and what the Jews had to suffer through. However, the part that truly hit home was seeing the crematorium and the ovens that the Nazis burned the dead bodies of countless victims in. After Treblinka, I thought most camps would be similar to that. Just some land with a few monuments to show what went on here. But Majdanek was much different. It still had pretty much everything that was there during the Holocaust, including the crematorium. I stared at the ovens and wondered what it was like to be here during the Holocaust and what went on here during that time. Just thinking about this in general is a scary thought. So actually seeing the horror that went on, especially in the crematorium, was a horror on a much different level. We davened mincha in the crematorium, which was a very extremely powerful experience and a very special mincha for me, as we were praying in the exact same spot that was made to make sure that we were not here today. And not only were we just here, but we were praying in that exact spot to our God, who watches over us and made sure that we were still around today. Poland was a very special and powerful experience for me personally, as my father came along, whose grandparents were Holocaust survivors, so having him there was very important to me. All in all, the camp of Majdanek and the Holocaust in general was a complete horror. And we are so lucky to be where we are today, as the Jews in the Holocaust were not nearly as fortunate as we are today. May their memories be a blessing.
Right, those who were tortured and murdered in Majdanek sexual. Thank you. We invite up Shmuley Fisher. Tell us about the extermination camp.
Treblinko was an extermination camp that was operated by the Nazis in World War II. The camp operated between 1942 and 1943 as part of Operation Reinhard, the deadliest phase of the final solution. It was the third killing center after Belzec and Civil War. Treblinka was an extermination camp, not a concentration camp. Jews were brought here just to be killed because they were Jews. 50 rail cars at a time filled with hundreds of Jews were brought to the train station in Treblinko. Nazis ordered Jews to disembark from the train and give all their personal belongings. Men separated from women and children were told to undress and stand on the side of the railroad. A camouflage fence and path led from the train station to the gas chambers. This path was known as the Tube. Jews were forced to run naked along this path to the gas chamber, to separately labeled as showers. Once the chamber's door was sealed, gas was pumped inside and everyone inside was killed. After the next train station would come and the same process happened. In fall of 1943, German officers ordered that Treblinka be dismantled. From 1942 to 1943, Treblinka's camp murdered over 900,000 Jews. During 1944, with Soviet troops moving in, camp authorities and Treblinka guards killed the remaining Jewish prisoners. The camp was dismantled and evacuated. All traces of what happened here were destroyed. Weeping flowers were sown on the ground, and German farmers were installed on the property to camouflage what occurred at this horrible place. When you went to the Treblinka, I remember it was snowing and very dark when we got off the bus. We walked along the train tracks, and we listened to stories from Rav Jake and Rav Tana about what the horrors happened here. When we got to the camp, I remember seeing this big empty field and wondering what this was all about. Rav Tana told us that this was where the camp was because nothing left was there. There was a big monument for memorial of the gas chambers and thousands of tombstones placed around. We were told to find a tombstone and place a hand on it and try to remember and imagine what terrible things happened to this person. When we gathered around the monument, I was very emotional and taken back what happened here. Treblinka was the most impactful part of the trip for me because we really had to think and imagine what happened here because there was nothing left for us to physically see. We have to remember what happened, even though there was nothing there. We have to tell our children, our grandchildren, because after us, there won't be anyone else to tell the story. We can't ever forget what happened to us. We have to show that this horrible event can never happen again. For each person in the Holocaust, there is a name. For each person, there is identity. Every person in the Holocaust has a story. We have a mission to keep telling that story and remember what happened to us in the Holocaust. Even though the buildings of Treblinka were only temporary, the effects will live on forever.
To commemorate those who were exterminated in the Reinhard camps of Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Eitan Schulman will light a candle. Invite up Tudor Orlansky, who will speak about Auschwitz.
Nazis started off with shooting squads, but that became too gruesome for the soldiers to continue doing. So then they switched to gas vans. This proved to be a clean way of exterminating Jews, but it wasn't efficient. Following the Wannsee Conference, 3 more death camps were built to help with the final solution to the Jewish problem: Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. At these camps, people would not be selected to work or die, they would just be sent straight to the gas chambers. But Auschwitz worked as a concentration camp and death camp. When I think about Auschwitz, I will always remember the horrific sights that most of us saw and learned about on our Poland trip. I will always remember the disgusting barracks that Jews were forced to stay in, the thousands of shoes that were ripped away, the massive gas chambers, the horrific stories, and just the sight of the camp itself. But there are a few specific memories that just feel different every time I think about this site. Throughout the trip, I was very confused on how to feel. There were people around me who were crying, and people around me who were just in complete shock of what they were seeing. But for me, I was kind of stuck in the middle. I wanted to have been able to cry, but for some reason I couldn't. I really didn't know how to describe how I felt until this one moment in Auschwitz. All of us who were on the trip learned a daf of Gemara that when we would be in Auschwitz, we'd make a Siman Bracha. When I heard about this before the trip, I thought this was a great idea, but I didn't realize how much this would actually impact me. As I mentioned before, I didn't really know how to feel, and I was hoping that going to Auschwitz would spark some sort of feeling within me. We started off the day in Auschwitz I. Auschwitz was initially a detention center for political prisoners, but as the war progressed, the Nazis needed more room for Jews and turned it into a network of camps where Jewish people were exterminated. When we got to the first part, I knew that there was something different about this place, and I had this eerie feeling. But when we got to Auschwitz II, Auschwitz-Birkenau, I was overcome with different emotions and feelings. I was thinking to myself that right now we were walking up the train tracks that was the last spot that millions of innocent souls ever saw. I was standing in a place where 1.1 million Jews were exterminated, people were exterminated. And as we were walking, I saw 2 kids in our group wearing the Israeli flag, and I finally understood what I was feeling. I had this huge feeling of pride. Here I am in a place that its sole purpose was to exterminate Jews, and I'm standing on that exact place years later, and all I could think was, you lost and I won. As we continued down the tracks, we stopped at the gas chambers. We were told a story about how the Jews were waiting in line to be put to death, and someone mentioned that it was time for mincha. So everyone, knowing what was about to happen, stopped and davened to Hashem. Then the experience that really put everything home was when we made the Siyum. As I mentioned earlier, we were standing in a place where the only purpose it served was to kill Jews, and now, how ironic that me, a Jew, is about to finish a Masechta in that exact same spot where the Nazis really thought they were going to succeed. This gave me the strongest sense of pride that I've ever felt. That I'm a part of this everlasting people that no matter what happens, we thrive. After this simple task of me learning just one daf of Gemara at my Malcolm in the base measures with my comfortable bed right up the steps, how can these people have been exterminated for just being Jewish? And I let this once in a lifetime opportunity of a year of learning and immersion in Judaism slip by. On our walk out of Auschwitz, we were told a story about how a lady named Esti Magid was pregnant in Auschwitz. But in Auschwitz, no one was allowed to have children. There was a doctor named Dr. Gisela Pearl, who was one of the best doctors in Hungary. And when she was shipped to Auschwitz, Mengele chose her to be the person in charge of the abortions. So when Esti found out she was pregnant, she went to Dr. Pearl and told her that she wanted to keep the baby, and Dr. Pearl agreed. It came time for her to deliver the baby, and when the baby boy was delivered, Dr. Pearl took the baby and drowned him in the bathroom and screamed, "A life for a life." Years later, they both survived the war, and Esti was pregnant again, and saw that Dr. Pearl had a practice in the city, and she wanted to cause a scene at her practice for what she had done years before. But when they both saw each other, all they can do was embrace. And Esti even let Dr. Pearl deliver the baby. And when she delivered the baby, she screamed, "A life for a life." After hearing this story, I thought that how lucky am I to be a Jew who was able to walk out of here alive, and how Baruch Hashem, I'm able to sit in a base medrash in a country where we have people to protect us, and where Jewish blood is not cheap, and how blessed we are to be able to complete the learning of our ancestors that was cut too short. May the memory be a blessing.
Commemorate the 1.1 million Jews that were murdered in Auschwitz at Gamos. We call on Yonatan Simitov, who will close the program.
So something that stood out to me, and probably to everyone from Poland, was just the scale of destruction and death that we're talking about. When we went to places like Treblinko or Majdanek, we were literally standing on the same ground as millions of people were before they were snuffed out. Millions. What is 6 million people? What does that number even mean? 1.5 million children. They're like, these numbers are impossible to grasp for us. And Ellie, in his speech, he tried to put it into perspective. But I think even then, it's impossible for us to imagine what 6 million really means, or how to even relate to that. When we went to Auschwitz, of course, Auschwitz is probably the most famous example of the genocide that took place and the scale of destruction that happened. But something that stood out to me from our experience at Auschwitz was the emphasis on the individual. A room with screens showing Jewish children singing and dancing before the war, not even knowing what was about to happen. A room with a book called the Book of Names, which tries to catalog all of them, however hard they may be, by name. A room with drawings on the wall made by children who probably all died. These rooms, they humanize the number, in my mind at least. The 6 million is hard to grasp, but one, you can relate to one. And 6 million is made of 6 million ones. And it made me think that the war between us and the Nazis, it's not really over. Obviously, in the physical way, it is. There's no more Third Reich. There's no more Nazis that are trying to get us. At least not in the way that they were then. But it's a different kind of war going on. Because what did the Nazis want? They wanted to kill us, yes, but it was worse than that, because they didn't want to kill humans. They had to dehumanize us first. to make us less than people, less than animals even, to make us into just like a statistic, a number on a sheet. And we struggle with that today because it's hard to relate to just a statistic or this many thousands or millions of people died. It's our job to not just mourn 6 million who died, but to help all of them, every single one, help them all live again, whatever way we can.
To commemorate the 6 million Jews that were killed in the Holocaust by Islam.